الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
الذي لا إله سواه الواحد الأحد الذي لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد صليت وباركت على سيدنا إبراهيم وعلى آل Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's being, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's relevance in our world philosophically and practically has never been until the modern age such a topic of contention and dispute and debate. We're living in a world, Hafidhakumullah, as you know, in which the very concept of the divine is treated with the utmost skepticism and even denial. With that are consequences. And of those consequences are that the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also likewise will necessarily be denied. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the infinite, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful, Ar-Rahim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most generous, Al-Kareem. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the truly appreciative, in a world in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence is denied. These beautiful attributes and values, His names and attributes that I must adorn myself with at my human potential, and that we socially must adopt and adorn ourselves with at our social level, these are also consequently denied. And so with the denial of the divine is the loss of beautiful, necessary values. And so the value of generosity, of karam, the value of shukr, of being grateful, the value of rahmah, of showing loving mercy, is also more and more absent from the world in which we live. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us of the reality of life when He says, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. By the passage of time, human beings are surely in a state of loss. This, as you know, is a very powerful exposition of the natural law of entropy. That as time progresses, the world becomes disorderly. A closed system will necessarily become more disorderly with the passage of time. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Except those who believe, they are not in this loss with the passage of time, and do good deeds. The good deeds are meant to maintain my faith and my iman. In an environment, we live in a closed environment, physical and also spiritual environment. And so with the passage of time, there will necessarily be the devolution of values, of norms, of morals, especially if you add to that a society in which certain values are treated with hostility, and there are those who would wish to erase divine values. Nonetheless, in such an environment, unless I am doing work, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, except those who believe and do good deeds. Good deeds are work. Good deeds are energy. Good deeds is the effort to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to maintain the order, the spiritual order, to maintain my spiritual ecosystem, to maintain the ecosystem of my values. Then, wal-asr will not necessarily apply to me. The law of entropy and moral entropy, by virtue of me working and struggling and striving, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's grace, I will be spared from moral entropy. And the entropy that comes and ultimately ends with the erasure of certain divine values. Today, Hafizakumullah, is the day of Jummah. Jummah is from the verb jama'ah. Jama'ah means to gather, to collect. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala every week gives me an opportunity not only to gather physically with other Muslims, but a day in which I am meant to gather my heart on Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. The day of Jumu'ah is meant to be a day of Jam'a, a day of collecting my heart, my mind, my energies on Him subhanahu wa ta'ala, a day of renewed focus, a day of rejuvenation for the next 6 days to come in the week. In this rejuvenation, on this day of Jumu'ah, I must ask myself, how connected is my heart, how gathered is my heart on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How focused am I in my mind, in my deeds, in my words, in my energies, in my will on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or how scattered am I? And in this respect, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, teaches us that of the beautiful attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that I must be gathered upon and must be focused upon in trying to emulate, at the level of my human potential. Because Allah Ta'ala's divine names and attributes, His asma wa sifat, are infinite in every magnitude. Yet, I am meant as a Khalifa of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, as Allah Ta'ala says, إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. Allah Ta'ala told the Malaika, I'm going to make a representative on earth, a steward on earth. A representative of the divine is one who mirrors at their human potential, at their limited, finite human potential, the divine names and attributes of Allah Ta'ala, for in that is true moral beauty. And so, of those beautiful attributes, he said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Inna Rabbakum Hayyun Kareem. Your Lord has haya. Your Lord is hayy. Your Lord has haya. What is haya? As you know, Hafizakumullah, often translated as modesty, or bashfulness, or conscientiousness, spiritual sensitivity, haya. And I think all of us, all Muslims, men and women, would have learned about this very, very essential Islamic value. But there are aspects of haya that I may not be aware of. He says, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Inna likulli deenan, Inna likulli deenin khuluqan, Inna likulli deenin khuluqan, wa khuluqul Islam al-haya. He said that every deen, every faith, every ideology, if you like, every religion has its own defining feature, its own defining virtue, characteristic. وَخُلُقُ الْإِسْلَامِ الْحَيَاء. And the khuluq of Islam is haya. That is, every ideology, every deen, every philosophy, every way of life has virtues, has characteristics that define it, that exemplify it. And in this text, he says, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that the defining feature, the defining characteristic of Islam is haya. And that's very powerful. Very, very powerful when we think about that. It means, practically speaking, that the value and worth of my Islam is defined by the value and worth of my haya. Because if I don't have the virtue of haya, then my Islam is to say deeply lacking. It says that if my haya is rich and deep and innocent and beautiful, it means that that is the quality of my Islam. In another text he said, Sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, Inna al-haya wal-iman qurina jami'an. Haya and faith are bound together, are linked together, are interfaced together. إِذَا رُفِعَ أَحَدُهُمَا رُفِعَ الْآخَرِ. If one of them is raised, if one of them is taken away, so too will the other follow. In this hadith, the first hadith, he said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, taught us about the defining feature of Islam. In this text, it speaks about the relationship between haya and iman and faith. And he says, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that faith and haya are bound together, are interconnected. And that if one is taken away, the other one is removed. If one is raised, so too is the other. And this relationship, this incredibly powerful, almost causal relationship, two-way causal relationship between the two, iman and haya, it tells me that any time anytime my haya gets better, anytime I mature in my haya, I am maturing in my iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As a Muslim, anytime my iman gets better, genuinely gets better, so too will my haya become better and more beautiful. And this relationship now, as Islam's defining feature, the first text, Islam's defining feature. And what does that mean? Islam at the individual level, the Islam of a family, the Islam of a community, the Islam of a state, the Islam of a civilization, the Islamic civilization. What must it have? What must it have as the most important khuluq? The khuluq of haya. And this text, now, the one about iman and haya, faith itself. And therefore, the ulama say that the word haya, or faith, or as you know, modesty, or spiritual sensitivity, and the word haya are connected. Haya, life, and haya, spiritual sensitivity. Haya and haya, because there is no true haya, there is no true life. Whether material life, physical life as we know it, four-dimensional life, or there is no true spiritual life except with the value of haya, the value of spiritual modesty. Istahya in Arabic means to give life, to resuscitate, to revive. It's the same root as istahya in the sense of to give haya, to give haya. And so, again, in a linguistic sense, this beautifully encapsulates the text of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that if I have a depth and richness of haya, so too will I have a depth and richness of Islam and Iman in haya. He says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, al-haya'u kulluhu khayr. Haya, all of it is beautiful, is good, is virtue. And this word khayr, it refers to every sense of khayr, both spiritual and material. We know as Muslims, or we must know as Muslims, the impact, practically speaking, on society when the value of haya is lost. Even in terms of material harm or physical harm. What happens when we lose haya at the level of the family? What happens when we lose haya at the level of our, as today, biological understanding of biological orientation? What does it produce of dichotomy, of pain, of confusion in society? Because al-haya kulluhu khair, as he said, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. He was described, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, by the companions. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم أشد حياء من العذراء في خدرها, that he صلى الله عليه وسلم had more haya than an unmarried maiden, innocent and pure, young unmarried maiden who lived in the innermost quarters of her home. Meaning by that, in part, doesn't know the world of men, is not precocious, is not aware of the world of men. She lived in that innocent state, young, unmarried. Her haya, and maybe we have, especially some of us who are older, and maybe some of us who come or have a sense of what traditional Muslim societies would be like, or were like. A sense of what that is, what individuals like that are like, in terms of their attitude and their behavior, and their presence. And so, they describe him, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, as having haya that's more than this unmarried maiden, innocent, pure young girl. His haya was more than that. كان أشد حياء. He had more haya than that. And when I first heard this, I couldn't believe it. The more I pondered it, I thought, can that be true? Because he was also, as you know, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was a Rasul. He was a Nabi. He was a teacher. He was a judge. He was a legislator. He strove for social and political justice. He was a military leader. He was a counselor. He was a mentor. He was all of those, but most importantly, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. How could he have that level of haya? Doesn't it sound to our minds, unfortunately, our Western minds, doesn't it sound incongruent, even impossible, that you could live in that sense of what he did and have and preserve that haya? But yet, his life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the most powerful evidence that that is not only possible, but it must be. And that seeming contradiction is only a contradiction that arises because of my lack of iman and my lack of yaqeen and the lack of the expansiveness of my rationality and my spirituality, because that's how he lived, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala awaken in me and in all of us the importance of this most beautiful virtue and characteristic. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not deprive me and you that we would find and we would reconnect its dormant potential inside of us in a way that is pleasing to Him. Subhanahu wa ta'ala. Astaghfirullah wa atubu ilayh. Fastaghfiruhu innahu wal ghafurur rahim. Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik alayhi wa ala alihi. In conclusion, hafidhakumullah, I remind myself and you that haya is not lost in one fell swoop. Haya is not lost immediately and suddenly. Haya is lost over a period of time. Haya is lost in steps, in stages. That's how haya is lost. When I was younger, I remembered a story that one of the imams told me, and I never forgot it. He said an experiment that was conducted. They had a pot of boiling water, and they brought the water to boil, and they placed a frog in the water. And the frog, the moment he touched the surface of the water, he jumped out. And then they took a frog, and they placed him in water that was lukewarm. And they gradually, degree by degree, raised the temperature of the water. And sure enough, the frog boiled to death. The point being that if I am not aware, spiritually aware of my environment and the impact of that environment on my values, on my tawheed, on my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if I'm not aware, mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's gaze upon me, upon my heart, how my akhlaq might be changing. If I'm not doing work in an environment that demotes haya, if I'm not doing work contrary to that, at least equal to the force of negative erasure of my haya, if I'm not struggling at least contrary to the force exerted by the external environment to strip me of haya, then it will be a losing battle. So I need to be working harder than the forces at work. I need to be spiritually more alert than the means generated outside to strip us from haya. And unless I do that, unless I have that consciousness, number one, and unless I have that practical connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you know of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of muraqabah, of watching my qalb, watching my heart, evaluating my words, evaluating my deeds, seeing what happens inside, filtering what I allow into my qalb. Unless I do that, and unless I control my sohbah, my environment, my fellowship by design, unless I design my environment, unless I do that actively and selectively and energetically, I'm going to be losing. We will be losing. Families will be losing. Children will be losing their haya step by step by step. Until days pass, months pass, years pass, and suddenly the change now is manifest to me, but it was always happening inside of me. Al-mar'u ala dini khalilihi, said he sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. A man will take the faith of their close friend, of their beloved. Meaning, I will be affected. Al-mar'u ma'a man ahab. I will be with the one I love. I will be with not only in the sense of in the akhirah, but I am with them. I have their attitudes, I have their values, I have their ways and norms of thinking. I am with them. I will be with them spiritually. And that with them, at-tab'u saraq, you know, the human nature, it steals from others. The human nature, it takes. If I'm placed in an environment, I will become that environment given time. No one is infallible in this regard. So unless I have my environment by design, and I'm very sensitive to my environment, my sohbah, the sohbah that I generate, the fellowship that I allow myself to be in, and that I allow my children to be in, to help them lovingly, gradually, wisely, to protect them from living in that giant, as they say, melting pot. You know, Canada is a mosaic, but the United States is a melting pot. We don't want to melt with our basic values and the constants of our values. We don't want to melt in that. If we melt, it should be for khair. Parts of us that need to melt for goodness. But the constants should not melt away. And therefore, I have to, hafizakumullah, be very sensitive to my in-person relationships and companions, and even more sensitive to my virtual companions, even more sensitive to my digital sohbah, and not to be naive. And it might be easier for you to be naive, living where you do, in Silicon Valley, not to be naive about the incredibly powerful effects of the environment, real and digital. Remember that a person will take the deen of their friend, and he used that word, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. A person will take the deen of their friend, ultimately, meaning not only the words and deeds and habits and fashions and norms, but the very values of that person, of that environment. Number one, to watch our environment, and number two, hafizakumullah, a reminder for me and you, to make my salah to make my salah a means of developing my haya with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because that concept of haya, it's not only about the way I talk, the way I look, the way I dress, it's the way I think, the way I feel, the way I interact, the way I sit, the way I walk, the way I deal with my father, my mother, the way I deal with someone younger, the way I deal with someone older. That haya envelops everything at the horizontal, interactional, transactional level with the khalq of Allah. But that haya has a nascence, it has a beginning. And that beginning is the vertical relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is haya from Allah. Allah is Allah, the infinite in beauty, the infinite in majesty. How should I feel if I am always accompanied by a very reverent, pious man or woman? How would I feel if every moment of the day they were at my side? As I walked, as I talked, as I ate, as I prayed, a teacher or a very reverent friend, Allah loving, special, beautiful akhlaq. How would I feel, and how would that feeling of my awareness of their presence affect how I related in my life to Allah and to His creation? Now imagine that Sahib is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that never leaves my side, who's aware of every dimension of my existence, psychological, mental, emotional, material, physical, spiritual, everything. Subhanah, He knows at every moment. And He is who He is, with His azamah, with His greatness, with His jalala, with His majesty. So let me make my salah, practically speaking, an awareness and a haya in having a conversation with Him. And if I do that every salah, to make my salah a quality salah, in which I'm aware of His gaze upon my mind, my emotions, my ideas, my words, my deeds, my body, my heart, my qalb, the recesses of my qalb, of my heart, then every salah will be, inshaAllah, a reconnection with the principles of haya, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And once I begin to experience that in my salah, it will naturally affect my transactions in my environment. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who listen and follow the best of what they hear. Please forgive me to mention this. I say that with some haya, but the institute that I'm affiliated with, the Suhbah Seminary, has a 5-year program that focuses on ilm with the purpose of akhlaq. One of our brothers will be outside handing out some information, should you be interested in learning about it. And this evening in one of the centers here, there's a discussion about the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the topic of yaqeen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not deprive us of beautiful akhlaq. اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين اللهم انصر من نصر الدين واجعلنا منهم ومعهم واخذل من خذل الدين ولا تجعلنا منهم ولا تجعلنا معهم اللهم اجعلنا من الصادقين ومع الصادقين اللهم اجعلنا هادين مهديين لا ضالين ولا مضرين ولا مغيرين ولا مبدلين اللهم اشف مرضانا وارحم موتانا وعاف مبتلانا واجبر كسرانا ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار أقم الصلاة إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
Please forgive me, I actually prayed another Jummah, and in some madahib you won't be able to follow me if I pray Jummah. So
استووا الله أكبر الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المكذوب عليهم ولا الضالين. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المكذوب عليهم ولا الضالين. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.